some serious stuff now.
Yes.
Behaviourism. This is like proper science.
It's real science. Real science.
That's a bit simplistic, but it's proper science.
It is. And that's why I developed, actually.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because Freud was not very
No,
scientific.
it wasn't.
A case study is not scientific proof.
Yeah.
Because Freud did use a lot of single people studies where he just evaluated their progress personally himself and wrote a book about it and said that was evidence for his theories. But in science, it's generally recognised that for something to be valid evidence, it should be replicable and standardised, and an actual experiment where you manipulate variables and see what happens,
Yeah.
and that's what behaviourism brought to psychology.
That was something Watson was actually really intent on. He wanted to make sure that if you could create something in one lab, it could be recreated in another lab or proved false.
And Watson was a key behaviourist.
He was.
He's the one who spearheaded this movement.
Yeah.
And so we will be talking about him quite a lot today.
Yes. Yes. He is pretty much the focus of today's episode. So behaviourism itself developed during the psychoanalytic movement, and it was Watson's rejection of the study of the consciousness and of more abstract ideas that we covered in Freud. In reference to consciousness, he stated that there was no evidence for it and that it was only being discussed because of spiritual reasons. So Watson proposed behaviourism to be an objective, experimental approach to psychology, and the theoretical goal that he put forward was to be able to predict and control behaviour.
Watson stressed the importance of experimenting on animals, but unfortunately at the time many psychologists couldn't see the relevance of doing experiments on animals and then applying them to humans.
Yeah. Whereas now, obviously, that's something that we do quite a lot.
Yeah.
We use animals, we study their behaviour, and then we see if that's almost similar, I suppose, to human behaviour. We've even looked at animal anatomy, so a lot of studies on how the brain responds to different drugs will be carried out on rats, because the anatomy of a rat's brain is very similar to that of a human brain. And then things like instinctual or evolutionary behaviour, we look mostly at chimps and things like that, because evolutionarily they're most similar to us. So animal experimentation has become very popular now, but at the time it was almost a taboo. Simply, people were offended almost by the idea of someone going, well, if an animal does this, maybe it's the same in humans. Like, no, they're very different.
I think in the early 1900s it was still sort of widely believed that humans had this special thing that made them different to the rest of the animal kingdom, but now we've come to accept that we've all got the same nerve cells, we've all got the same other kinds of cells in our brains and in our bodies, and yes, we might have a slightly more complex network than other species, but the network is still the same, and if we're just looking at simple functions, then we can look at those functions and extrapolate that to humans.
Yeah, definitely. So, as we said, Watson wanted to make sure that whatever was produced in one lab could be produced in another, and this was kind of the first emergence in psychology of the idea of falsifiability, which is an idea in science where an idea should be able to be proved right or wrong through testing.
I've got a lovely analogy for this, which I remember from my psychology A-level things. If one was to make the statement that there was no such thing as black swans, this is a falsifiable statement, because all it would take is someone to find one black swan for that statement to be falsified.
Behaviourists, as a group, limited themselves only to things that could be observed and tested, and they would only make theories and hypotheses regarding these observable things.
For example, one of the hypotheses that Watson made was that at birth only two things could sort of innately elicit fear, and that was loud noises and a loss of physical support. So you're sort of holding things.
Yeah.
And so, as a good scientist would, he went out to test these theories, despite his advocacy of animal research. He did do this one on humans.
This is the infamous Little Alba experiment, which Watson conducted with Rayner in 1920. Little Albert had no original fear of a rat. They tested this by presenting him with a rat, and he approached it quite happily, played with it, stroked it. They then paired the presentation of the white rat with a loud noise directly behind Little Albert's head. The loud noise would make him cry, recoil, try to run away, and he eventually associated this fear response with the presentation of the white rat. So So they found that eventually, after a couple of presentations of the two at the same time, simply putting the white rat in front of Albert would make him run away or cry. At one point he tried to crawl away so fast that they had to catch him before he fell off the table. He was that scared. Just in Watson's defence and Raynard's defence, they did plan to try and extinguish this fear.
Which you can do in rats.
Yeah, okay, it's definitely possible, but unfortunately little Albert was taken away from the hospital where they were conducting the experiments before they were able to do this. So
it got worse.
Yeah.
Little Albert started to fear anything that was white and fluffy. The rat was white and fluffy. This included other animals, a fur coat, cotton wool, and I believe Santa.
Yes, a mask of Santa.
So Watson and behaviourism ruined Christmas.
So Watson outlined basic conditioning as we use it today. His ideas of pairing stimuli together to create a response are widely used in psychology.
It's classical conditioning.
It is, yes. So he theorised that at birth an infant is born with unconditioned responses. So you present particular stimuli like the loud noise or the removal of physical support and you'll get the response, and there's no training required. The child doesn't have to learn this, it's just something that they do automatically. So these stimuli that call out a response without any training are called unconditioned stimuli, and the response is an unconditioned response. Watson suggested that pairing the unconditioned stimuli with a new stimulus, like the white rat, presenting them together enough times would allow for the new stimulus to produce the unconditioned response without the unconditioned stimulus present. So using this approach, he argued that any stimulus can be used to produce any response. All it takes is learning. And he famously stated that order in the universe is merely a matter of conditioning.
And so that's all we'll brush over for behaviourism for the moment, because we do want to visit conditioning in quite a lot of detail, or a better way to put it might be the associative mind, but we will go into that later because it's something that we're both quite interested in and is quite interesting.
Yeah, and because it's still used today, we just want to brush over it at the moment.
Yeah, because we just repeat ourselves otherwise.
We'll definitely be revisiting it. It's so popular in experiments today. This is where
it's been popular for a long time.
Yeah.
Maybe not this classical notion of behaviourism, because it did sort of deny quite a few conceptions of like the role of beliefs and behaviours, and anything sort of cognitive it sort of chose to ignore, which is why it is a bit simplistic by today's standards, but it's certainly influenced a lot of any cognitive research really now stems from behaviourism, which is a bit paradoxical because obviously behaviourists initially rejected cognitions, and now cognitive neuroscience and stuff quite heavily looks at conditioning. And for example, the neural processes behind conditioning were studied with anaphasia, and that's a sort of big sea slug. It might be a tiny sea slug, I'm not sure. It's a sea slug. And it's just got these like a couple of really big huge neurons, and that's its brain, and because of that they can sort of look at the recoil response when they stimulate the snail and look at how the conditioning process works, and then sort of again extrapolate that to a more complex form in all of us.
Definitely.
And it's all been inspired by Watson.
Yeah, and he definitely spearheaded how we study psychology today, because he introduced the objective experimental side of it. So he did only look at the behaviour, but with the techniques available to him at the time, that was the only objective observable thing that he could look at. Whereas with today's technology, we can look at how the brain is stimulated, which neurons fire when, and in a lot more detail. But he only had behaviour available to him. So how we actually study psychology today was massively influenced by Watson.
I think you could argue maybe that Freud popularised psychology and brought it into the public consciousness. Watson gave it the structure and backbone it needed to actually be of use to society. And then I think well, next week we're going to cover humanistic psychology, which is the third force in psychology, and I think that one sort of repopularised and rehumanised it, so it sort of went from not scientific but popular. This is kind of all at the same time, so it's confusing. But Freud would make it popular but unscientific. Watson made it scientific but slightly less popular outside of the academic community, because no one wants to be told that they have no free will and they're only doing stuff because they've been conditioned to do it. And then the humanistic guys brought back in free will and made it a lot more about the therapy again. And this is all sort of in the last 100 years. So
yeah, it all moved really fast.
Yeah.
Really, really fast.